Well, thank you all for coming. Great to be here at the Homer Center for the Arts, and I'm very pleased to present my work in this beautiful setting. There's a lot going on these days, and I don't expect we're going to solve all the world's problems tonight. The question for many of us is, what is an artist to do? Tonight, we'll focus on how the notion of beauty has evolved over time and where we individual artists find ourselves in the current culture. For over 50 years, I have explored different ways to express my ideas, drawing on two main sources: art history and the personal narrative of my own life. Today, I will contrast these two influences and how they play out in my artwork. Man is the measure of all things. Through this axiom, Protagoras established human proportion as the design ideal for the ancient Greek architecture and sculpture, and posits our aesthetic experience in the innate beauty and nobility of the human figure. Greek artists sculpted thousands of statues of the idealized human figure and envisioned their gods as perfect human specimens. Such statues grace museums all around the world and continue to define our notions of timeless classical beauty. Classical or ideal elements, as defined by Plato, are impermeable, perfect entities that exist outside the natural world, in the world of ideas. For example, rectangles, triangles, cubes, and other geometric forms. Existing in their own higher realm, they are not dependent on the subjective experience. In fact, for Plato, they are more real than the outside world. By his definition, they are superior to subjective experience. In the Platonic world, there's no need for self-expression. The artist's job is to create enduring images using classical proportion and classical subject matter. For centuries, art academies embraced this idea in their pedagogy. Throughout much of history, art students learned by making copies of master works. The turmoil of World War I and the collapse of the monarchy system caused artists to rebel against the status quo, against the classical ideals. Surrealism and Expressionism, which value the individual experience, commandeered the aesthetic order. No longer tethered to architecture, painting has become a prime venue for individual expression. Although I'm fascinated by the Platonic ideas of perfect forms, my bias is closer to the Expressionist school, where form and color are used to create a specific emotion. For me, art is not so much about expressing my feelings as it is about creating a dynamic field of imagery that evokes feelings in the viewer. As any painter will tell you, the difference between a thing and its representation is huge. Images on the canvas, like Plato's ideal forms, are fixed in space and time. Though they may represent living temporal things, they cannot move around in real space. Being flat shapes fixed to a flat surface, they become iconic representations of a world that no longer exists. In this way, paintings idealize and define the past. Picasso, when questioned about his iconic portrait of Gertrude Stein, said, quote, "Everyone says that she does not look like it, but that does not make any difference. She will." This is the power of art. This exhibition is organized in pairs of images. The images are from different periods in my work. I got the idea from my son, who told me, "Dad, you should do a show of classic Ed Raths." The Bible tells us man is created in the image and likeness of God, but the Greeks declared man is the measure of all things. The Greeks also said the gods are created in the image of man. Through observation, the Greeks discovered the mature human to be 7 heads tall. Thus, 7 heads high became the formula for the ideal figure. To distinguish the immortals from the puny mortals, they sculpted their gods 10 heads high, and the demigods, like Hercules, 8 heads high. These longer proportions being more elegant. The contemporary fashion industry continues to use elongated figures in fashion illustration. This painting is called Venus de Maple, and it's modeled after the renowned Venus de Milo, which is considered by the art historians to be the ideal female figure carved in marble. Classically proportioned figure, which is missing half of it because I think the Romans took a sledgehammer to it. A few years ago, started imagining trees as living beings, and I got the idea to make a painting of a tree that grew in the shape of the Venus de Milo. And I was trying to create the idea that trees are the measure of all things instead of man. Likewise, I drew this embodiment of David, the Michelangelo classic statue. David is entrapped in a living tree, not quite frozen, but stuck in place on a pedestal, venerating his stature as the ideal male figure in the world of trees. These pieces combine the classical idea of the idealized human form with unidealized natural life forms, both of which inform my notion of beauty. Another area of concern for me as an artist is architecture. Like the American populace, American architecture is a sort of melting pot of styles from all around the world. Much of our best architecture is a synthesis of imported details mixed with colloquial American motifs. Much of our public architecture expresses the Jeffersonian notions of architecture in its simplicity. Any of you who have traveled to an Eastern European country, a former communist country, will certainly remember when you cross over the border on a train and all of a sudden you're confronted with communist-era architecture. Cubes with square windows, rectangular windows, they're all gray, they all look the same. They look the same in every country. So this was designed for the proletarian. Everybody has an equal apartment, everything's the same. Completely different from our culture, which is individual based, right? We're driving around this area, every house looks different, every farm looks different. Okay, now this painting is called Plaza One, inspired by the Brooklyn Borough Hall, where the borough president's offices are. In downtown Brooklyn, where I live. It's surrounded by a public plaza, a rather large plaza, where people congregate and enjoy socializing and eating while watching the young daredevils skateboarding on Saturday mornings. And like countless government buildings, Borough Hall is designed using classical and neoclassical Greek architectural elements and details. Those details embody Greek ideas of virtue, justice, and democracy. In this painting, the broken tricycle breaks the idealized space, adding to the specter of violence and chaos that we all experience and which we hope to ameliorate through good governance and/or the justice system. So I'm just trying to contrast the realities of idealized government versus the real people. Okay, this painting, Ivy, is inspired by a meticulously restored private home in New York City's West Village. And the building has impressed me with its lovely human proportions and delightful interface with nature. You don't see too many ivy-covered buildings in New York, but it's always beautiful to see like the natural element added. For me, this is the embodiment of serenity and beauty in architecture. And I changed the setting to give it a more European feeling. In other words, there's no taxis and, food carts in the way here. I was sort of inspired by Balthus's paintings of European cities. Okay, now landscape is the next genre. So planet Earth, with its formidable physical features, inspired much mythology to account for its awesome scale and dynamic forces. Likewise, the natural world and landscape have been a direct source of inspiration for my work. I draw and paint places from dreams and memories as well as from observation. I use composition and color to express the beauty of these places, some of which, like my grandparents' farm, no longer exist in this world. This painting is titled Black Dunes, and while the second one is called Dune at Noon. These are two of the most beautiful landscape I know on the East Coast. When my family used to go camping near Amagansett on Long Island, we used to visit a place called the Walking Dunes, which is a small remote landscape on the sound side. It's an incredible piece of blown sand. All the wind that comes off the Atlantic, it blew the sand into this enormous sand dunes. There are trees that are 30 feet tall that are buried in sand except for the top like 5 feet. They look like bushes, but there's an entire tree underneath and they're still alive. I was inspired to draw and paint this magical landscape because it transports us away from the city and all of our troubles. These two over here, these are earlier paintings from, this painting is from 1983. It's called Myers Road. And 6 weeks after getting married, my late wife, Laura, and I went out to my parents' farm in Wisconsin for a honeymoon. It was hot and muggy all week, no breeze. And then after 5 days of rain, around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky cleared and the sun came out. And we walked down the dirt road, and we were delighted by all the songbirds flitting about, playing in the puddles and singing their hearts out. The painting commemorates that happy, blissful time. And this is the first time I've taken the painting out of my house, by the way, for this exhibit. This is a composite image drawn from memory. The left side of the painting depicts a simple hiking trail in the terraced woods at St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. And on the right-hand side, it's showing a view of Yellow Lake, which is in western Wisconsin. There actually is a lake in the Minnesota scene to the right, but it's a different shape. So I combined the two to create a feeling of movement. I was trying to get a sense of moving like you're going down the stairs. I remembered this painting from when I was in high school, and I went to high school at the Abbey. And I brought my son there, and we were walking down the trail, and he recognized the trail from the painting. This piece is called The Weeds of Windsor. After dropping our daughter off at college in Chicago, my wife Laura and my son Jacob and I, we drove to Detroit, and then we crossed over to Windsor, Canada, and we stayed there for the night. So after dinner, I went out for a walk along the highway. The weeds and the wildflowers were so delicate in the evening autumn light, and they reached out to me like panhandlers in the New York City subway. As I brushed past them, the red sun setting in the west and the beauty of the scene etched on my mind. 6 months later, after a long and valorous fight, Laura died from breast cancer. And I went into a state of total insomnia and worked on this painting straight through for 6 days and 6 nights. And I wanted to commemorate our stay in Windsor and the beauty of the weeds and the Queen Anne's lace, so frail yet so alive. The other piece here is called The Other Side. This painting is from 2007. A lot of paintings at the time, I was trying to divide them in horizontal sections. This was a pretty strongly delineated piece. The bottom section, it shows a beautiful shoreline on a lake. It's spring-like with all the flowers and small plants. And then the middle section is more, turbulent with the water cutting through the earth and pushing down. And then the top part is a bleak, denuded forest with long shadows of the evening. Okay, so I was thinking about the loss of my wife at the time, and this was 2 years after she died. My colleague, a fellow artist named David Johnson, theorizes that the bottom represents the early days of my marriage, when Laura was healthy and strong, the middle section, when she was fighting cancer, the top section represents the afterlife after she died. His insight into the symbolism inherent in my work from this period was eye-opening to me. And I suppose you artists may experience the same thing when you do your work. You oftentimes don't know what the work is about or why you did it. You just can't help yourself, you just got to do it. It's almost a compulsion. You can't stop working, and that's how it is when I'm on. Okay, now back to the architecture theme. Mansard 1, this is Mansard 2. When I arrived in New York in 1977, I was 24 years old, came from Minnesota, and I landed a studio in the Fur District on West 29th Street, right near Madison Square Garden. And I was totally broke. I didn't have anything like to entertain myself except my artwork. So I used to walk around that neighborhood. That neighborhood has some of the most fantastic architecture that I had ever seen. There are several large buildings with the mansard roof, this kind of French design roof that slopes back with tiles and so forth, and these nice metal trim pieces. And I would just stare at them. They still, to me, stand out as exceptionally beautiful architecture in the city. And I was told that many of these incredible structures were built by master stonemasons who had recently immigrated from Italy. And I mentioned that some of the architecture is a synthesis of architecture from other places, Italian details, the French details. Also, it's almost like a palace, right? It almost has this sense of the European buildings where you had royal families and extremely wealthy people living in these gigantic mansions, and regular people living in much more humble kind of structures. So the combination of immigrants bringing their architectural details to America was very stunning. In New York, anytime you go down there, it's just breathtakingly beautiful, the buildings. Now these two pieces, this is an interior scene. These are declay prints, by the way. It's called Interior with Painted Wall. So this is the early version, and then I added more color to the second version. I made the scans 2 different times, so there's only one finished painting which looks like that. I was trying to bring a depiction of nature into a simple interior in the way that the Japanese artists integrate nature into their architecture. In Japan, it's a philosophy. They worship nature as part of their religion. And when you go into a beautiful Japanese home, they'll put a little window at the foot of the bathtub, and there's a garden outside the window. I personally would like to see more of that type of influence in our architecture. Now, these two pieces, this is Columbine 1 and Columbine 2. So this is a drawing of a flower that my parents had in their backyard. The Columbines lived underneath a lilac bush, and when we were little children, we used to go under the bush and lay down in the dirt and look at them really close and look at the little spiders and all the little creatures. Human beings universally identify flowers as objects of beauty. Philosophers and poets from Schopenhauer to Shakespeare to Emerson have declared flowers the essence of beauty. The Transcendentalists, which is Emerson's group, found beauty in nature to be an expression of God's love for us. The world is a garden, the Garden of Eden. Emerson's poem, The Rodera, celebrates a small flower whose sole purpose is to express its own beauty as part of God's creation. Likewise, I paint landscapes to commemorate the beauty of places and things gone by. As an artist, I search for ways to express the beauty of these places. Ergo, beauty is an essential part of my work. By declaring that the Rodera's reason to exist is simply to be beautiful, Emerson opened up the door to art for art's sake. He also opened up aesthetics to include personal narrative as a legitimate subject for art. So this is the poem by Emerson, the Rodera on being asked, "Whence is the flower?" In May, when seed winds pierced our solitudes, I found the fresh Rodera in the woods, spreading its leafless blooms in dark nook to please the desert and the sluggish brook. The purple petals fallen in the pool made the black water and their beauty gay. Here might the red bird come his plumes to cool and court the flower that cheapens his array. Rodera, if the sages ask thee why this charm is wasted on earth and sky, tell them, dear, that if eyes were made for seeing, then beauty is its own excuse for being. Why thou wert there, O rival of the rose, I never thought to ask, I never knew. But in my simple ignorance, suppose the self-same power that brought me there brought you. So in closing, the purpose of classical art was to educate and inspire the public through depiction of the great mythological, religious, and historical narratives. Through looking at such art, we identify with both the glory and the suffering of humanity and feel connected to the past. Being tied to monarchies, governments, and religion, classical art reached a vast audience, many of whom were uneducated or even illiterate. The emphasis of classical art is our common heritage, not one's individual feelings. Contemporary art, disconnected from the classical narratives and from architecture, has become a free-for-all for self-expression. Sharing their moments of ecstasy and agony, the individual artist's personal narrative fills the vacuum left behind. The hope being that our individual joie de vivre and suffering will translate as something others can not only identify with, but use to navigate their own way through this existential labyrinth.